Long before any man faces the challenges of the world, before temptation arrives in obvious form, before the failures and mistakes that define regret, there is a quieter battlefield. It is not in the streets, not in the markets, not in the arguments with others. It is inside the mind. Every struggle, every collapse, every moment of weakness has its roots there, in the thoughts a man chooses to nurture or ignore. The mind creates the enemy long before the devil ever steps forward. It rehearses the lies. It magnifies doubt. It whispers fear. And in those rehearsals, a man often loses battles he never even knew he was fighting. The mind is a cunning architect. It builds scenarios, crafts fears, and imagines failures with precision and patience. It shows a man what could go wrong and convinces him that these visions are not only possible, but inevitable. A single thought that goes unchallenged can become a pattern. A repeated pattern becomes a habit, and a habit left unchecked becomes a foundation on which failure is built. The devil does not create these thoughts. He does not need to. He merely waits for the mind to construct them and then points them out, like a coach of destruction, showing the man how easy it will be to surrender. Many believe that evil arrives suddenly, in a dramatic moment of choice. A man thinks he will recognize it and resist it, that temptation will shout and he will hear. But in truth, most of the damage is done quietly, in the rehearsal of what might be. The mind rehearses compromise, weakness, and defeat in the dark hours, when no one else is watching, when the world is still asleep. It whispers doubts: you are not enough. You cannot succeed, it's not worth trying. These thoughts, though silent, are more destructive than any external attack because they come from within. They are intimate, familiar, and convincing. A man who does not understand this often blames failure on circumstances, on people, on fortune, even on the devil himself. But the wisest understand that external forces are rarely the cause of true ruin. They are catalysts at best. The mind has already consented to the collapse. The man has already allowed the seed of failure to take root. The world is only reflecting what the mind has prepared. Consider how often a man hesitates because of imagined obstacles. He has not yet faced the challenge, but he has already created a barrier in thought. He rehearses the fear of rejection, the humiliation of failure, the shame of being wrong. And when the actual moment arrives, he is no longer responding to reality. He is reacting to the elaborate construction of his own imagination. The enemy is not the circumstance. The enemy is the mind that preordains defeat. This is why self-awareness is the first form of defense. A man must learn to observe the rehearsals of his mind as they happen, to notice when a thought begins to spiral, to ask whether it serves growth or merely entertains fear, to question, is this my truth or my imagination running unchecked? A thought repeated in fear becomes conviction if left unexamined, and conviction shapes action. One can act with courage despite fear, but one rarely acts against conviction without awareness. The mind does not always present its rehearsals as threats. Sometimes it appears as advice, sometimes as logic, sometimes as caution. A man may hear, perhaps this is too much for you, or maybe you should wait, or it's safer not to try. Each thought may seem prudent, even wise, and because of that it gains authority. But authority gained from repetition alone is dangerous when not tested against truth and discipline. A single unchallenged notion can become the lens through which all decisions are filtered. The danger is compounded by the mind's tendency to normalize these rehearsals. The more a man allows fear, doubt, or excuses to occupy his thoughts, the more natural they feel. What once seemed uncomfortable becomes ordinary. What once seemed unreasonable becomes habitual. And in this slow, imperceptible shift, the mind turns itself into the greatest enemy a man will ever face. It is quiet, patient, relentless, and deeply persuasive. A wise man does not fear the world because he has learned to fear what happens inside first. He knows that discipline, courage, and clarity are forged internally long before action confirms them externally. He guards his thoughts as he guards his body or possessions, for unchecked thought is far more dangerous than any sword or argument. To train the mind is to prepare the battlefield before the battle even begins. To neglect it is to surrender before the fight. Every moment of hesitation, every rationalization, every internal debate over fear or desire is a rehearsal of defeat if left uncontrolled. The devil will never need to shout because the mind is already doing the work. The suggestions arrive softly, through doubts and what-ifs, but the man who is not vigilant receives them as truth, and once accepted, they shape choices, actions, and eventually character. The insight here is not that men must become rigid or suppress thought. On the contrary, the mind is a tool that must be observed, guided, and questioned. Awareness allows a man to notice rehearsals of failure as they occur, to challenge them, and to redirect his thoughts toward action, courage, and clarity. The enemy created in thought can be dismantled by conscious observation, by deliberate reflection, by refusing to grant untested ideas authority. It is a quiet war, fought moment by moment, in silence, in the invisible corners of the mind. And it is in this war that a man either becomes master of himself or prisoner. The devil can wait, can whisper, can suggest, but he cannot compel. It is the mind's rehearsals that open the door, and only a man's vigilance can close it. Every strong man, every person who has overcome extraordinary circumstance, first conquered his own rehearsals of fear, doubt, and limitation. They did not wait for the enemy to arrive. They learned to recognize the enemy being built within themselves long before it could manifest outside. They observed the rehearsals, questioned their validity, and refused to consent. This is how mastery begins, not in the world, but inside the mind where battles are first imagined, long before the devil whispers, long before circumstance presses, long before failure appears. The mind has already chosen its own direction. And if a man does not recognize this, he will live his life reacting to rehearsals instead of creating reality. The true enemy has never been the devil. It has been the mind that prepares for defeat before the man ever stands to fight. And so the first victory of wisdom is awareness. For when a man sees the enemy in his own thoughts, he no longer fears the world outside. The mind is a strange and powerful place. It creates the world we see, the reality we inhabit, and the boundaries we believe are unbreakable. The most dangerous voice a man will ever hear does not shout. It does not demand. It does not appear suddenly from without. It whispers from within, and it convinces not by force, but by agreement. The devil, in all his cunning, is powerless without the cooperation of the mind, for it is the mind that decides what is reasonable, what is permissible, what is true. And it is in this quiet consent that men lose more than they realize. The devil suggests, he does not command. He presents ideas, options, pathways, and disguises them in familiar language. Just this once, he says. It won't hurt. No one will know. You can make up for it later. Each phrase is gentle, each suggestion reasonable, each invitation seemingly harmless. And yet, in the way the mind receives it, a seed of destruction is planted. The mind, when unobservant, nods, consents, and slowly allows the suggestion to grow into habit. The collapse, when it comes, feels inevitable, even rational. Most men believe that they fail because the devil is strong, or because circumstances are cruel. They imagine the enemy is outside, something they can point to, resist, or fight. But the truth is more insidious. The real power lies not in the external, but in the internal. The mind grants authority to the suggestion before the temptation even arrives. The devil only speaks. It is the mind that opens the door. Every failure begins with a quiet acquiescence, a subtle approval, a thought entertained one too many times. The danger is not in the suggestion itself, but in the way the mind justifies it. A single whisper, when repeated, becomes logic. A minor compromise becomes a principle. The mind creates a narrative to support its own permission, and suddenly the man believes he is making the right choice, when in reality, he is merely following the path suggested by a voice he mistook for reason. The devil never had to shout, because the mind was already listening and agreeing all along. Consider how easily this happens in ordinary life. A man is tired. The mind tells him, rest a little longer. The suggestion seems innocent, even sensible. But in the same moment, it postpones discipline, delays action, and allows hesitation to creep in. A habit is formed, not by force, but by the mind's consent. Another day, another small compromise, and what seemed reasonable becomes a chain. The mind, thinking it is acting with autonomy, has already surrendered. This is why awareness is crucial. Man must learn to listen not just to the devil's suggestions, but to his own response to them. He must recognize the moment when the mind agrees to what it should resist. Every thought, every excuse, every rationalization must be observed, questioned, and tested. Only then does the mind regain its rightful authority. Without this vigilance, the mind becomes a willing accomplice, and the devil's whispers grow louder in their effects, though not in their volume. The consent of the mind is also why self-deception is so common. A man can convince himself he is resisting when he is merely negotiating. He can believe he is strong when he is actually compromising. He can mistake rationalization for wisdom. The devil's genius is not in forcing the man to act, it is in persuading the mind that surrender is choice. And when the mind believes it is choosing freely, it becomes nearly impossible to convince otherwise. The battle is not in the outward action, it is in the quiet permission granted internally. Habits, character, and destiny are all formed in these quiet moments of consent. One thought agreed to today becomes a pattern tomorrow. One small indulgence, one unchecked desire, one unexamined fear transforms into identity if left unchallenged. The mind, acting as judge and jury, legitimizes behaviors that eventually define the man. By the time the consequences arrive, the mind has already constructed a world in which they feel deserved or unavoidable. The devil never had to coerce. The mind made the decision willingly. The wise man understands that influence begins internally, not externally. The mind is the gatekeeper of action. To prevent the whispers of destruction from shaping life, a man must first master his mind. Observation, reflection, and deliberate questioning are the tools of this mastery. A thought arises, and he asks, does this lead to growth or decay? Is this choice serving my higher self, or merely appeasing momentary desire? Am I agreeing to something I will regret? These questions disrupt the quiet consent that allows the devil's suggestions to take root. Furthermore, the mind often disguises agreement as practicality. It presents compromise as wisdom, indulgence as reward, and procrastination as strategy. And because these suggestions feel reasonable, the mind accepts them without resistance. This is the trap. The mind believes it is in control, yet every agreement subtly undermines strength. A man may appear disciplined externally, but if the mind quietly consents to suggestions against his higher interest, he is already weakened. External battles are reflections of internal choices. This is why the path of mastery is not about silencing the devil, it is about observing the mind. The moment a man recognizes that the mind decides which suggestions to entertain, he gains freedom. He no longer reacts automatically. He no longer allows impulses to dictate action. He evaluates, chooses, and if necessary, refuses. The devil may whisper endlessly, but without the mind's consent, his influence is powerless. A man loses his power, not when temptation arises, but when he stops questioning his own agreement. When he stops examining the subtle ways his thoughts justify indulgence, fear, or inaction. The mind can be the most loyal ally or the most cunning enemy, and it is entirely a matter of attention and awareness. Every step toward conscious evaluation strengthens the man. Every moment of unexamined consent weakens him. Finally, the insight is simple yet profound. The devil's whispers are effective only because the mind is willing. It does not matter how clever the suggestion, how appealing the temptation, or how desperate the circumstances. Without the internal yes, nothing external can control the man. Power is not in resisting the devil, but in mastering the mind that grants him entrance. A wise man knows that each day presents countless suggestions, some subtle, some blatant, and that each thought agreed to is a vote for the man he becomes. He observes, questions, and chooses deliberately, for in the quiet consent or refusal of the mind lies the fate of every action, every habit, and every life. The mind decides. The devil whispers, And the man who understands this is no longer a prisoner of either. A man often underestimates the power of his own thoughts. He believes that identity is formed by actions, by words, by accomplishments, by failures. But before any of these external signs exist, a mind has already taken shape. Thoughts, repeated over time, become beliefs. Beliefs, left unchecked, solidify into identity. And identity, once formed, dictates behavior. What a man consistently believes about himself is far more decisive than the events that surround him. The enemy is rarely outside. It is built from within, in the quiet rehearsal of doubt, fear, and limitation. The mind is patient. It does not need to push a man into immediate failure. It only needs to suggest, to question, to entertain possibilities that weaken conviction. A single thought of limitation, if allowed to linger and repeat, gains authority over perception. What was once a fleeting worry becomes a principle. What was once hesitation becomes habit. The man begins to see the world not as it is, but as his weakened mind interprets it. The devil does not need to enforce these interpretations. He merely points to them and encourages repetition. This is why self-perception is so critical. A man who believes he is weak becomes weak. A man who believes he is incapable becomes incapable. It is not the truth of circumstance that defines him, but the verdict passed silently within his own mind. The most subtle enemy is the one that convinces a man of his limitations while appearing entirely reasonable. This is who you are, the mind whispers. This is as far as you can go. This is what you deserve. And when repeated often enough, these whispers form a reality that feels inevitable. A wise man understands that thoughts are not commands. They are not evidence. They are possibilities, and they must be evaluated. One must observe the mind with the same scrutiny applied to the world outside. Every recurring thought must be questioned. Does this align with who I want to become? Does it strengthen me, or does it diminish me? Without such vigilance, the mind slowly cedes control, and identity is shaped by the weakest, loudest, most familiar narratives. The mind also has a tendency to justify. It explains away hesitation, excuses failure, and softens disappointment. What once would have been recognized as a small lapse becomes a pattern. What was a fleeting indulgence becomes a defining habit. The mind is not malicious, it is efficient. It protects, conserves, and rationalizes. And if a man does not actively direct it, the mind will build an identity that serves comfort, not growth. Consider how easily identity can be reshaped without awareness. A man begins to think, I am not strong enough. He repeats it silently, unchallenged. The next time a challenge arises, the thought becomes an interpretation of the situation. He hesitates, doubts, and withdraws. Then he tells himself, see, I told you I couldn't do it. The belief has justified itself, and the mind has cemented identity through experience, not external force. The cycle repeats, growing stronger with each iteration. What is most dangerous is that the mind often disguises limitation as realism. It presents caution as wisdom, compromise as prudence, and fear as insight. And because these thoughts feel reasonable, they are rarely questioned. A man may appear practical, sensible, even disciplined. But if the mind has quietly decided what is possible and impossible, he is no longer fully free. The boundaries of thought become the boundaries of life. The devil does not need to create fear, he only needs to exploit it. He does not need to impose weakness, he only needs to draw attention to it. Every thought allowed to define identity without examination becomes a tool for internal sabotage. The external world simply mirrors what the mind has already sanctioned. The battles we fight are reflections of the ones we have already rehearsed internally. The mind is the battlefield, and identity is the territory claimed before the fight begins. A wise man takes responsibility for the narratives he allows to repeat. He recognizes that thoughts about himself, his abilities, and his worth are not static truths. They are formative forces that must be nurtured or corrected. Each unchallenged belief strengthens the wrong kind of identity, while each examined and redirected thought strengthens the self he intends to become. The process is continuous, quiet, and invisible, but it is the foundation of all character. Habits, actions, and decisions follow identity like shadows. A man who sees himself as capable approaches challenges with confidence. A man who sees himself as powerless approaches them with hesitation. External circumstances amplify what the mind has already declared. Strength, courage, and resilience begin in thought. Weakness, doubt, and surrender begin in thought as well. The mind shapes perception first, action second, and consequence last. A man accepts this truth, he gains power over the silent enemy within. He begins to notice recurring beliefs and questions them. He observes assumptions that have gone untested for years. He challenges interpretations of past failures, and in doing so, he weakens the authority of limiting thoughts before they can dictate behavior. Awareness is the first act of mastery. A wise man also understands that identity is malleable. It is never too late to change the beliefs that define him. But change requires observation, attention, and deliberate choice. It is not a sudden transformation. It is a series of decisions to reject old narratives and reinforce new ones. Each time a limiting thought is questioned and corrected, identity shifts slightly toward the person the man intends to be. Repetition is the key, for the mind is patient and persistent. External challenges may test a man, but they do not define him. Only the interpretation of those challenges within the mind shapes his character. Two men may face the same hardship. One emerges stronger, the other weaker. The difference lies not in circumstance, but in the internal beliefs that guided their actions. The mind is the filter through which experience is understood. Mastery of this filter is mastery of life. This is why the internal enemy is so powerful. It is quiet, invisible, and self-legitimized. It disguises limitation as reason, fear as prudence, and surrender as choice. But a man who observes his mind, questions recurring beliefs, and directs his internal narratives becomes impervious to these subtle manipulations. Thought becomes deliberate, identity becomes intentional, and action becomes aligned with purpose. Every man has the same opportunity. The question is not whether external forces will challenge him, but whether he will master the internal forces that shape who he becomes. The enemy was never outside. It was always within, in the mind that allowed fleeting doubts to define permanent identity. The moment a man realizes this, he sees clearly where true power begins and where true defeat originates. A man who understands that thought becomes identity knows that mastery begins in awareness. He sees the rehearsal of weakness and refuses to let it define him. He knows that the mind can be both ally and enemy, depending on which thoughts are repeated, which beliefs are questioned, and which narratives are chosen. And in this understanding, the greatest victory is achieved. Control over the mind, and through it, control over life itself. A man often underestimates the subtlety of his own mind. He believes that strength is measured by effort alone, that discipline is only tested by external challenges, that comfort is harmless. Yet it is comfort, the desire to avoid effort, the temptation to choose ease over growth, that becomes the mind's most effective weapon against progress. The mind does not simply create enemies in the form of fear or doubt. It quietly convinces a man that resistance is unnecessary, that avoidance is wise, that stagnation is safety. And it is in this quiet surrender to comfort that a man begins to lose the battle before it is even fought. Comfort is seductive because it feels right. The mind convinces itself that avoiding pain is rational. It whispers that difficult choices are unnecessary, that delay will not harm, that temporary ease is practical. And because these suggestions feel intelligent, they are rarely challenged. Rest a little longer, the mind says. Skip this task just for today. It's not urgent. Each thought seems harmless alone, and so it is allowed. But when repeated, each one builds a path away from discipline, from growth, from purpose. Comfort, in this way, becomes a trap dressed as wisdom. The mind's love of comfort is patient. It does not demand surrender immediately. It waits for small openings, moments of fatigue, seasons of discouragement. When a man is tired, the mind whispers, "You deserve a break." When a man feels unappreciated, it whispers, "Why bother?" When progress feels slow, it whispers, "Patience is unnecessary, ease is sufficient." The advice seems kind, even fair, but its kindness is a disguise. Behind each suggestion lies arrow, scion, a soft weakening of resolve, a slow drift from who a man intends to be. Many men mistake comfort for intelligence. They believe that avoiding struggle or taking the easier path is clever, but cleverness without purpose is a form of surrender. The mind rationalizes indulgence and inactivity in the same way a river carves a path through stone, imperceptibly, over time. Each concession to comfort seems small and reasonable, yet the cumulative effect is a man living far below his potential. He no longer notices the erosion because it is gradual, and because the mind, his closest advisor, assures him it is necessary. A wise man understands that discomfort is a signal, not a threat. Discomfort is the mind's way of testing commitment, of asking whether he is willing to pursue growth despite resistance. It is not an enemy to be avoided, but a guide to be followed with clarity. When the mind presents an easy alternative, a shortcut, a reprieve from discipline, it is often an invitation to surrender disguised as reason. To accept it without question is to hand over control of life to the very weaknesses the mind has cultivated. The danger of comfort is that it rarely feels urgent. A man who succumbs to fatigue, laziness, or distraction does so without immediate consequence. The results of surrender do not appear instantly, which is why it is so effective. The mind convinces itself that avoidance is temporary, that delay is harmless, that nothing of importance is lost. But days, weeks, and years accumulate. What begins as minor indulgence or avoidance grows into habit, and habit hardens into identity. The man eventually becomes someone shaped, not by deliberate choice, but by his repeated surrender to comfort. The devil understands that a mind steeped in comfort is easier to manipulate. Suggestions of fear, doubt, indulgence, or neglect arrive more readily when the mind is accustomed to avoiding effort. A man who consistently chooses ease becomes fragile when challenges arise. His will, untested, is weakened. The mind that once offered safety now becomes a collaborator with stagnation, creating internal excuses to justify decisions that undermine growth. To resist this subtle enemy, a man must cultivate awareness. He must notice when the mind is offering comfort in place of discipline and question it immediately. He must ask, does this choice move me closer to who I wish to be, or does it allow me to drift? He must distinguish between necessary rest and indulgence disguised as rest, between reflection and procrastination, between patience and avoidance. In each moment of temptation, the mind presents a choice, and the wise man refuses to be deceived by the softness of comfort. The pursuit of purpose requires discomfort. Every act of courage, every stretch toward mastery, every investment in growth demands some form of resistance. The mind, however, will argue for postponement, minimize urgency, and exaggerate difficulty to preserve comfort. This is why consistent progress is not determined by external obstacles, but by the internal willingness to endure friction and reject ease when it threatens progress. A man who allows comfort to dictate choices forfeits the very struggles that would make him strong. Comfort also distorts perception. When a man seeks ease, challenges appear greater than they are, effort feels unbearable, discipline feels unfair, and risk feels larger than it is. The mind magnifies fear to justify avoidance. What is actually manageable is perceived as dangerous. What is temporary is perceived as permanent. What is opportunity is perceived as burden. In this way, comfort becomes a lens through which reality is warped, and decisions are made not from truth but from distorted fear. The wise man recognizes this pattern and prepares for it. He does not rely on bursts of motivation or emotion to resist the lure of comfort. Instead, he structures his life to minimize unnecessary indulgence, to automate discipline, to strengthen habits, that require minimal effort of will. He removes temptations when possible, simplifies choices, and builds routines that align with purpose. By creating an environment that supports effort, he allows the mind to work with him rather than against him. Another danger is that comfort appeals to pride. The mind will convince a man that avoiding effort is smart, that taking shortcuts is clever, that delay is practical, and in doing so, it erodes humility, patience, and persevere. NCE, pride masquerading as intelligence blinds men to the quiet theft of potential. They believe they are in control, yet control has been quietly surrendered in pursuit of ease. True mastery, then, is the ability to endure discomfort with clarity and intention. It is the refusal to accept the mind's subtle suggestions for ease when they contradict purpose. It is the willingness to act consistently, even when motivation fades, even when progress is slow, even when the immediate reward is absent. It is the recognition that the cost of comfort is far greater than the temporary relief it offers. A wise man does not fear discomfort. He understands it, accepts it, and moves through it deliberately. He knows that every challenge endured strengthens identity, that every choice made despite the temptation of comfort reinforces discipline, and that every act of resistance builds momentum that the mind cannot easily overturn. He trains his attention to distinguish between rest and surrender, between necessary pause and the invitation to stagnation, and he acts accordingly, day after day. The mind will always present the choice between ease and growth, between comfort and challenge. The devil does not need to force surrender when the mind already leans toward ease. Awareness, reflection, and deliberate choice are the defenses that prevent this quiet defeat. The man who consistently questions the mind's suggestions, who refuses to be seduced by comfort, who embraces challenge as the path to mastery, becomes nearly unstoppable. And so, the greatest weapon of the mind is not anger, fear, or desire. It is comfort. It offers the illusion of safety, the appearance of intelligence, the false serenity of ease. The wise man sees this clearly. He does not fight the mind through force, but through vigilance. He does not eliminate comfort, but he refuses its subtle betrayals. He aligns thought with purpose, action with discipline, and life with intentionality. And when he does, he discovers a truth few ever realize. The mind, once mastered, becomes the greatest ally, and comfort, once understood, is no longer a weapon, but a choice he wields deliberately. A man often believes that control over his life is determined by circumstances, by fortune, by the actions of others. He thinks that failure comes from outside forces, that temptation is only effective when it is obvious, loud, or dramatic. Yet the truth is far more subtle and far more dangerous. A man loses control the moment he stops questioning his own thoughts. The most destructive forces are not visible, they are internal, and they gain power when a man ceases to examine them. The mind, when left unchecked, becomes a master of disguise. It convinces him that passivity is wisdom, indulgence is justified, and surrender is choice. And in that quiet ascent, the enemy rises. The danger of unexamined thought lies in its familiarity. A thought repeated often enough becomes a belief. A belief left untested hardens. And to habit. Habits in turn shape action, and action eventually defines character. Most men do not fail because they were forced into poor decisions. They fail because their minds quietly prepared them for compromise, long before the external choice appeared. They follow a path already carved in thought, believing it is freedom, when in reality, it is the outcome of silent, repeated agreements with weakness. The mind is clever in the way it undermines. It does not rush. It does not demand. It suggests, gently, in tones that feel reasonable, even wise. You deserve rest, it says. One more day will not matter. It is acceptable to delay. The words feel safe, and so they are allowed. And the accumulation of these small permissions gradually erodes discipline, obscures clarity, and diminishes resolve. The moment a man stops questioning, he has already begun to lose. The devil does not need to coerce. He only needs the mind to remain unexamined. Self-deception thrives in this environment. A man convinces himself that he is acting rationally when he is actually following a narrative his mind created to preserve comfort and avoid challenge. Every justification, every excuse, every rationalization is like a brick in a wall separating him from the person he could be. He believes he is making choices freely, yet the freedom is an illusion. The internal agreements made without scrutiny dictate outcomes more effectively than any external coercion ever could. The moment a man stops questioning is also the moment he begins to automate surrender. Actions once deliberate become habitual, but not in service of purpose. They are the execution of an internal script written by fear, laziness, and compromise. The mind, unchallenged, rewrites priorities quietly. He may appear disciplined to the outside world, but internally, the scripts of weakness direct his decisions. External circumstances then reinforce what has already been decided within, creating the illusion that life is constraining him when the real constraint is self-inflicted. This is why awareness is essential. The man must observe his own thought patterns, noticing when repeated suggestions arise and questioning their validity. He must examine whether a decision, a desire, or an impulse serves growth, or simply appeases the mind's inclination toward ease. It is in these moments of reflection that power returns. Once a thought is observed and challenged, it loses its authority. Once an impulse is questioned before it becomes action, the mind is no longer a passive accomplice. The danger is amplified because unexamined thoughts feel automatic. A man believes he is responding spontaneously, yet he is often repeating a pattern crafted over years. Fear, doubt, and rationalization arrive not as overt attacks, but as familiar companions. They have been invited repeatedly, and so they are trusted. The mind convinces itself that these companions are practical guides, even necessary advisors, and the longer remain unquestioned, the more entrenched they become, until the man is no longer fully free to act according to conscious choice. Temptation does not need to be forceful. Its strength lies in the mind's acquiescence. The devil whispers, but the mind shouts consent. Every unexamined thought grants legitimacy to weakness. Every habit that is accepted without scrutiny further entrenches internal authority for surrender. A man may resist external pressure admirably, yet fail quietly because the internal dialogues of doubt, justification, and fear have already made the decision. The outcome is inevitable because the true battlefield was never outside, it was in the mind. The wise man, therefore, cultivates vigilance. He does not assume that conscious decisions are enough. He observes the underlying patterns of thought that precede them. He notices recurring excuses, familiar rationalizations, and habitual fears. He asks of every thought, does this align with my purpose? Does this build strength? Does this serve the man I intend to become? By questioning before assent, he breaks the chain that allows weakness to transform into identity and habit. Habits themselves, when automated, are both powerful and dangerous. They shape life silently, without requiring constant attention. But if they arise from unexamined thought, they shape it toward limitation. Conversely, habits formed through deliberate observation become extensions of intentional action. The difference lies entirely in whether the mind is questioned or allowed to dictate unchecked. One builds mastery, the other builds surrender. Even when temptation is overt, the pattern remains. A man confronted by an external challenge reacts according to the narratives already established in thought. If the mind has permitted doubt, hesitation, or compromise in advance, the external event is only confirming what was already decided. If the mind has cultivated clarity, courage, and intentionality, the same event becomes an opportunity to act with purpose. The decisive factor is internal, not external. The true battle is fought within the mind, and victory or defeat begins there. Observation alone, however, is not enough. Questioning must accompany it. A man cannot simply notice weakness and continue as before. He must challenge it, redirect it, and, if necessary, replace it with a stronger narrative. Each internal agreement is a choice to empower or disempower oneself. Every repeated thought that goes unquestioned is a surrender. Every challenge to it is an act of mastery. The mind, once trained to be observed and questioned, ceases to be a passive accomplice and becomes a tool for deliberate action. The consequences of unexamined thought are cumulative. One neglected pattern may seem insignificant, but over time, small permissions lead to large defeats. One day, a man may wonder how he arrived at a life that feels out of control, that seems dictated by circumstance or by others, when in reality, he merely followed the scripts quietly written by his own unobserved mind. The devil does not need to orchestrate disaster. He only needs the mind to stop questioning itself, to accept and to obey. A wise man does not allow his mind to operate unattended. He observes, questions, and deliberately shapes his internal narratives. He knows that the quiet consent of thought is more dangerous than any external challenge, and he treats it as a battlefield worthy of attention. By challenging the mind, by refusing automatic assent, he takes control of his actions, his habits, and ultimately his destiny. The insight is simple yet profound. The greatest loss occurs not when temptation strikes, not when circumstances are harsh, not when the devil whispers. It occurs the moment a man stops questioning, the moment he ceases to observe, the moment he allows his own mind to make choices without scrutiny. Awareness and deliberate examination restore power. They are the first steps toward mastery and the foundation upon which all freedom is built. A man who understands this sees clearly where true control begins and where true defeat originates. For the mind, when questioned and observed, becomes a servant. When left unexamined, it becomes the most formidable enemy. There comes a moment in every man's life when he realizes that the most formidable battles are not fought in the world outside, but in the quiet, unseen corners of his own mind. Until that moment, he may believe that strength, courage, and mastery are won through action alone. He may believe that victory is determined by circumstance, by chance, by confrontation with external threats. But true mastery begins elsewhere, inside the mind, in the subtle art of observation, where every thought is witnessed, every impulse noted, and every suggestion weighed before it is allowed to shape action. The moment a man becomes the observer of his own mind, the greatest enemy he has ever faced loses its authority. Observation is not passivity. Many men confuse the act of watching with inaction, but in truth, observation is the first act of control. It is the conscious refusal to obey every thought that rises, the discipline to notice a desire without immediately acting, the capacity to separate the self from the mind's suggestions. The devil may whisper, the mind may plead, but when a man watches without surrendering, he gains something invisible yet powerful, the ability to choose. Action without awareness is habit. Action with observation is mastery. A man who becomes the observer of his own mind begins to see patterns he had previously ignored. He notices which thoughts arise in moments of fatigue, which impulses come when he is insecure, which fears emerge when he is pressured. He recognizes that the mind is not a neutral servant, but a complex battlefield of impulses, memories, desires, and rehearsals. And in recognizing these patterns, he discovers the most essential truth: nothing commands him without his consent. The mind suggests, it nudges, it reasons. But the self has the authority to respond, or not, according to purpose, rather than impulse. This awareness transforms the way a man experiences life. Where he once reacted automatically, he now responds deliberately. Where he once obeyed fear or desire without question, he now questions, evaluates, and chooses. The difference may seem subtle at first, perhaps a single hesitation before responding to anger, a pause before giving in to temptation, a moment of reflection before making a decision, but these moments accumulate. Each conscious choice reinforces self-mastery, strengthens character, and gradually reshapes identity. The external world does not change, yet the man changes, and with him, the nature of every encounter and every challenge. Observation also dissolves illusion. The mind has a habit of disguising weakness as reason, indulgence as reward, hesitation as prudence. A man who simply follows thoughts as they arise believes he is acting intelligently, yet he is often walking along the path already prepared by fear, comfort, and habit. Becoming the observer allows him to see the disguise. He notices when his mind is negotiating against his higher interests, and he refuses to participate. Awareness exposes the subtle manipulations that otherwise dictate behavior without the man even realizing it. The power of this practice lies in its subtlety. It does not rely on dramatic feats of will or sudden bursts of motivation. It is quiet, consistent, and invisible. A man who masters observation is not necessarily the loudest, the fastest, or the most aggressive. He is simply the one who refuses to surrender unconsciously. He allows suggestions to arise, but he does not allow them to rule. He listens, but he does not obey. He evaluates, but he does not panic. In the calm of observation, the mind loses its ability to dominate. Every thought becomes an invitation rather than a command. The devil may whisper, the mind may urge, but the man remains separate from both. He can act or refrain. He can consider or ignore. He can let the suggestion pass without it leaving a mark. And in this separation, freedom is born. Freedom is not the absence of thought, nor the elimination of temptation. It is the refusal to obey every thought as if it were truth. It is the understanding that mastery begins not in controlling circumstances, but in controlling response. Observation also fosters patience. The mind, left unchecked, seeks immediate satisfaction, rapid outcomes, and constant reassurance. It wants instant validation, quick comfort, and swift results. When a man becomes the observer, he notices the impatience, the need for immediate reward, the impulses that arise from fatigue or desire. He does not act on them immediately. He allows them to pass. In this way, he trains himself to tolerate delay, to endure friction, and to act in alignment with purpose rather than emotion. Patience, cultivated in observation, becomes a foundation of strength. Moreover, the practice of observing the mind cultivates humility. It teaches a man that he is not always fully aware of the motives driving his thoughts, that not every desire reflects his highest interests, and that mastery is an ongoing process, not a destination. He learns to question what feels natural, to test what feels reasonable, and to challenge what feels inevitable. In this humility, he gains clarity. He sees both the power and the fallibility of his own mind, and he uses that awareness to act deliberately. Observation also protects against the deceptive power of habit. Habits, once formed, can operate independently of conscious intention. A man may believe he is acting freely, yet his habits may dictate his choices. By watching the mind continuously, he identifies patterns that are unhelpful or destructive. He can choose to replace them with more purposeful routines. In this way, observation becomes both a shield and a tool, a shield against unconscious surrender, and a tool for shaping life according to deliberate intention. The observer does not act in reaction to fear, desire, or ego. He does not allow fleeting impulses to define permanent choices. He sees each thought, each feeling, each suggestion, and measures it against purpose. He asks, does this serve me? Does this strengthen me? Does this align with the man I intend to be? And when the answer is no, he lets it pass, silently, without drama, without guilt, without internal debate. Each refusal reinforces mastery, and each moment of deliberate choice builds momentum toward a life led consciously rather than dictated unconsciously. This process also cultivates resilience. Life will always present challenges, temptations, and setbacks. The mind will always offer shortcuts, excuses, and rationalizations. But a man trained to observe his own thoughts is not swept away by these forces. He has already established a foundation of awareness. He knows that no thought, no urge, no external circumstance has power without his consent. The battles of the mind have been anticipated, observed, and mitigated, leaving him free to act with clarity, courage, and purpose in the external world. The ultimate insight is this: mastery is not achieved by eliminating the mind's suggestions, nor by silencing impulses, nor by resisting every desire. It is achieved by stepping outside the immediate sway of thought, and observing it. It is the calm recognition that the mind can suggest, but it cannot command. It is the understanding that the self, the observer, is separate from the constant flow of thought, and it is from this vantage point that freedom, control, and strength emerge. A wise man practices this continuously, for observation is not a one-time act. It is a lifelong discipline. Each thought, each urge, each suggestion is met with awareness and consideration. Each internal agreement is questioned before it is granted. And through this steady practice, the man becomes the master of his mind, the architect of his identity, and the sovereign of his life. The enemy, once so formidable, is rendered powerless in the face of deliberate awareness. And when a man reaches this level of clarity, he realizes a profound truth. The greatest enemy he ever faced was never outside him, never dramatic, never loud. It was the mind itself. And mastery began the moment he stopped obeying it unconsciously and began to watch it consciously.